Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our study called How the Story Ends. We are right in the middle of discussing the book of Revelation, or almost exactly right in the middle after our discussion last week of chapters 9 and 10. And now we're about to launch into chapter 11. And let me just give you just a brief recap of what we've talked about so far. The Lamb, who is Jesus, has taken from the Father's hand a scroll. This scroll contains within it the unfolding of human history and the final conclusion to the story of humanity. And as he opens up each seal, there are going to be things that happen on earth that bring that plan to its appropriate conclusion. And along with that thing, there's going to be a lot of judgments and destruction towards those who are sinful, while also some good things towards those who are being saved and rescued from this time. So you have the seal judgments, and for the first 3.5 years of this 7-year period of time, it seems to be, yes, there's general problems in the world, but it doesn't get quite so crazy. And then it seems like around the halfway point, there's a transition from something, from some sort of generalized judgments of war and famine and conquest, to more targeted, specific, God throwing certain judgments upon the earth. And inside of that seventh seal, there's now 7 trumpet judgments. And with these trumpet judgments, you start to see major destruction happening and major loss of life. Then we talk about the last 3 trumpet judgments are considered the 3 woes. In other words, they're like the first 4 are bad, but then it gets worse with 5, 6, and 7. 5 is, I believe, an invisible demon army that is unleashed on the earth to torment people for 5 months. I don't know if the torment is physical or emotional or mental or all of the above, but for 5 months they get to torment humanity and not kill them, but torment them to the point where humanity wants to die, but apparently they're not able to find ways to die. And they have to live with the torment, which is horrifying. Then you have the 6th trumpet that we talked about last week. And in that 6th trumpet, you have this giant army, 200 million strong. And they're either humans or they could be demonic figures as well. But I think these are visible, and they go throughout the earth, and they exterminate 1/3 of the population of the planet. God removes his protection, and he unleashes these destructive forces in the world, and evil always wants to destroy. God does not plant the desire to destroy in the heart of evil. He simply, at times, allows them to do what they have already determined they want to do, as a form of judgment against the world. And then the sad thing is that after this extermination, the 2/3 of humanity that is left hold on to their sinful ways that got them in trouble in the first place. And so the world, and who knows how many months it takes for this judgment to play out, for this army to go through and kill all these people. It's probably a long time, probably months. It could even be a year or two that this is unfolding. But chapter 10 has a little bit of a parenthesis where John is established as a prophet who is of equal quality and trustworthiness with the Old Testament prophets, and where there's a little bit of a hint that when the 7th trumpet is blown, that's when all the mystery will cease. That's when all the information will be out there, all the cards will be on the table, and all of a sudden, all the pieces that were hard to fit together will somehow all come together. And then we come to chapter 11, which is where we pick up today. And if you're looking at your notes, these are the same notes as last week, but it's part 3, and the title is The 2 Witnesses, okay? And this really is what I'm calling back to the action, because chapter 10 is somewhat, here's what goes in the blank there, parenthetical. In other words, chapter 10 is like a parenthesis. It doesn't really keep the action going. It just tells you something that's going on while or right after the events in chapter 9. And so chapter 10 is sort of like a parenthesis, and now chapter 11 we pick up, and we go back to a description of the action. There's things that are happening. And this is all going to set us up. Chapter 11 is going to set us up, or I should say the first 14 verses of chapter 11 are going to set us up for that 7th and final trumpet. Now, the crazy thing about this 7th trumpet judgment is that it's not a separate judgment. It contains 7 other judgments. It's kind of like the story about the kid who he found the lamp, and he rubbed the lamp, and a genie showed up. And the genie says, okay, you have 3 wishes. And the kid wished, number 1, I want to be super rich, right? I want to have I want to have a really long life. I want to live to be 500 years old. And then his third wish, he says, okay, with the third wish, I want 3 more wishes. Now, the genie probably says you can't do that. That's against the laws. At least Robin Williams' version of the genie says you're not allowed to do that. That's against the rules. But when it comes to these judgments, every time you get to the seventh one isn't a standalone judgment. It includes 7 other ones. So it's 7 times worse than any of the ones that came before it, right? So this 7th trumpet judgment is going to contain 7 additional judgments. And with this, all of God's wrath is going to come to an end. Like all the judgment is going to get poured out. In fact, the image of these judgments are bowls. And the bowls are filled with God's wrath. And God's going to just dump them one at a time onto the earth. And horrifying things are going to happen to earth as a result of that judgment. Okay? But that hasn't happened yet. In chapter 11, verses 1 through 14, which is what we're going to tackle today, in verses 1 through 14, you get one last bit of action from all the events that lead up to that final trumpet judgment when the last little gasp. And honestly, I think the bowl judgments and everything that happens there, that's going to happen very quickly. Like, I don't think there's going to be a long stretch of time. Like here, I said in the trumpets 5 and 6, those could describe months or even a couple years worth of time. I think once you get to the bowl judgments, they're going to happen like boom, 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 boom. I think it's going to happen maybe in a day or a matter of days, a matter of weeks at the very, very end of this 7-year period. So right now we're in kind of the center of that horrifying 7-year period where stuff is happening. And we find out that there are 2 new characters that pop onto the scene that I believe have been a part of the scene for a long time, but we're just now learning about them here in this text. Okay? Now let me read the first 3 verses, and I'll hit the first 3 verses. So it says this: Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out. For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Now, we'll come back to those 2 verses in a minute, but I want to hit these 2 witnesses first in verse 3. And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Clothed in sackcloth. So, what do we have here? In verse 3, we have 2 new characters, and I'm just going to call them the 2 witnesses. In fact, that's what God calls them, my 2 witnesses. And basically, they are going to deliver, and this is the first blank on your sheet here, they will deliver messages to humanity from God for 3.5 years. The 1,260 days, if you go according to a lunar calendar, which is what Israel works off of or worked off of in the time of the Bible, which is only 30 days to a month. 30, if you divide that into 1,260, you get 42 months, which if you divide that into 3.5, that gives you 3.5 years of time. So these guys, and it says they're going to prophesy. Well, what does that mean, to prophesy? To prophesy means you're going to deliver messages. God has something to say. He tells the prophet tells the messages to the people. So for 3.5 years, these 2 witnesses are going to bear witness to the messages God has given them to speak. 3.5 years. Now, this is important because the question is, okay, which 3.5 years? Is it like 3.5 years starting at the middle and going all the way to the end? I don't think so, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. Is it they start at the very beginning and they do it for the first 3.5 years? It's possible, but I don't think it's likely. I think somehow they overlap between the 2. So they'll start, and this is the way I have it. Their ministry probably started sometime before the 6th trumpet, okay? But the end, that's the first blank, the end of their ministry happens just before the blowing of the 7th trumpet. So in other words, I don't know when their ministry begins. First of all, this 200 million man army or million demon army that starts to kill humanity, how long might it take to do that? It might take 2 years. It might take 3 years. to comb the earth and kill and to destroy the 1/3 of humanity that you've been sent to destroy. Maybe it doesn't take that long, but it could take conceivably quite a long time. Especially since there's already been a lot of chaos, a lot of people that have probably spread out, gone underground, who are hiding, and they don't want to be around in places. They're probably not going to be all huddled together. They're going to be spread out. Some people, it's going to be like post-apocalyptic times, okay? That's literally, this is the apocalypse that they talk about and that they make all the movies about. Humanity's going to be dispersed and spread out. It may take some time to find them and exterminate them. But either way, these guys minister for 3.5 years. And I think they start sometime before that sixth trumpet. That's why they're being described here. Is because during the time of the sixth trumpet, when this 200 million man army is going through the world destroying people, they're currently in their ministry. Now, it's possible they started sometime maybe during the fifth trumpet with that 5 months of the tormenting. It could have happened in the first 4 trumpets. And again, it's possible that goes all the way into that first half somewhere of the tribulation. We don't really know when the start point is, but I think the end point is the blowing of the 7th trumpet. Now, I told you, let me just try to visualize it, okay? So if we have this is the start of the tribulation, right? And we know from the book of Daniel that the tribulation is going to be 7 years. We also know that there's a very important event that happens at the midway point. At the midway point, there's something called the abomination of desolation. We did already talk about it. If this is unfamiliar to you, go back a few weeks and check this out. There's a midpoint event called the abomination of desolation, where a human idol is paraded into God's temple and desecrates it, so that the worship of humanity or of an idol is happening in the place that's supposed to be set aside for the worship of the one true God. There's going to come a point where someone is going to establish idol worship in the temple itself, the temple that exists in that time. That happens at the midway point. Now the question is, where do the judgments fit into the 7 years? And honestly, nobody really has done a great job because the scriptures don't say clearly. Here's what I believe based on what I've studied so far. The seal judgments that we've already talked about, I believe they take place more or less in the first 3.5 years of this time frame. Okay? The seal judgment. Then I think somewhere right around that midpoint when the abomination of desolation happens and then everything shifts, right? For Israel, this part is largely peaceful. This part, Israel is going to be a target and they're going to try to exterminate Israel. So from this point on, I think the trumpets go to like about here, to be honest with you. The trumpets. And then I think you have the bowls right at the very end. But this is probably not, I just wrote it big enough so that you could maybe read it from where you are, although sometimes it's hard to read from a distance, and I apologize if you can't see it. But this is bowls. It could only be like this short. It's possible the bowl judgments happen like boom, and then Jesus comes back here, and we have the Battle of Armageddon and all that other fun stuff we'll talk about later. But I think the way the seal judgments are in the first 3.5 years, the trumpet judgments start around that midway point, the abomination of desolation, and stretch quite a ways. And then I think the bowls happen almost right at the end. So the question is, where did these two witnesses begin their ministry? I think they either began their ministry like somewhere like right here, maybe during the end of the seal judgments, and they're present through all of these trumpet judgments, and I think they come to an end right here before the 7th trumpet is blown and the bowl judgments begin. So they minister for 3.5 years, but it's not from the middle to the end or from the beginning to the middle. It's some point in here to some point in here. These are the two witnesses. Does that make sense? I hope so. I hope it makes sense. What else do we know about these guys? The third subpoint here. They will be in a perpetual state of mourning. Look at verse 3 again. I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. That's where I get the expression of mourning, clothed in sackcloth. In the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, if you were beset with incredible sorrow, if you are mourning the loss of something, you would indicate that publicly. There's like a ritual. And the ritual was you would clothe yourselves in just scratchy sackcloth, I guess. I don't know what other word to use. Scratchy fabric. It was probably ripped and torn and stained. And you would wear that for a certain amount of time to indicate to everybody that you are in mourning. It's kind of like, it doesn't happen anymore, but there was a tradition where if you lost a spouse or lost a child, you would wear black for a certain amount of time while you're in a period of mourning. That is kind of close to this idea here. So for 3.5 years, they are witnessing, they're prophesying. We already know that they're delivering messages to the world, but they're also in a perpetual state of mourning. They wear these sackcloth. They wear sackcloth all the time. Now, why? Why are they mourning? What are they so sad about? I think what they're sad about is they're sad about the hard-heartedness of humanity that has led to the necessity of all these judgments that are happening all around them. So think about this. Suppose they're ministering during all of these trumpet judgments that happen, and millions of people and hundreds of millions of people are dying, and things are being destroyed, and society is destroyed. These two witnesses, they're delivering messages. Probably the messages they're delivering are, turn around, come back to God. You are sinning against God. Your idol worship is horrible. Your murders are terrible. Your sexual immorality is causing this. All of these things are preventable. Come back to God. In other words, they're doing what prophets do. They go to the capital city. They scream at the people to change their ways so that the bad things stop happening, so God's judgment stops falling, or so they can avoid God's judgment. Right? And humanity is not listening. We already saw that at the end of chapter 9. They're not listening. They're just merrily going on their way. They're like, we're going to double down on all of our rebellion against God. So why are they sad? They're sad because humanity is unwilling to repent. They're unwilling to repent. But actually, I think there's something more to it. Another reason why they would be in mourning that I'll get to in just a minute. Okay? Now, let me go back to verses 1 and 2. I told you I was going to go back to verses 1 and 2. In verses 1 and 2, we see this. I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, that's the Gentiles, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Now, what I think he's describing is there will be, okay, let me give you the blanks first. So, it seems that their prophetic ministry will be centered around a rebuilt temple, that's the first blank, for the worship of God, that's the second blank, in the city of Jerusalem, that's the third blank. Okay? It seems like they are doing their thing very close to where this temple is. It's been rebuilt. Now, if you go to Jerusalem today, the closest thing you will find to a temple, to the worship of the one true God, is the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall you may have heard about, that's there in Jerusalem. Okay? Right now, in the spot where the temple should be standing, there's a giant Muslim mosque called the Dome of the Rock, which is probably the most beautiful man-made structure I've ever seen in my entire life up close. And it's really not even close. But that's beside the point. The issue is that there should be a temple to God in that same spot. And right now, there is a mosque to Allah there. So obviously, we haven't reached this time yet. But by the time these events are unfolding, by the time the 70th year of the book of Daniel is complete, there is a new temple. And Daniel goes out to measure it. Now, that's also, by the way, a connection back to the book of Ezekiel, but I don't want to go there because it's a bit of a distraction from our point. But if you look in Ezekiel chapter 40, Ezekiel is given a measuring rod to do the exact same thing for a new temple that'll be in God's kingdom one day. But anyway, that's another story for another day. But here's the key thing. Notice he says, I don't want you to measure the outside courts, which, by the way, in the Old Testament was called the court of the Gentiles, where the Gentiles could come, because the city, the holy city, that's always been Jerusalem, is going to be trampled by the Gentiles for 42 months. Well, how long is 42 months? It's 3.5 years. So basically what happens is there's this crazy event right at the midpoint called the abomination of desolation, when the temple that has been created for the worship of God is desecrated by an idol. And it's an idol of a human. And people are invited now to worship a new God that looks like a human in the space where the God of the universe was supposed to be created. So there's a desecration of the temple right here. And then it says, for 42 months, the Gentiles will control Jerusalem. So the Gentiles will control and trample, it says, the holy city, which means any Jews that live there are under the oppression of Gentile overlords, just like in the time of the Romans, just like in the time of the Babylonians. The Gentiles will be calling the shots instead of God's people. It seems like the Jews have some control over their life and over their worship for the first 3.5 years of this time frame. But in the second half of this time frame, whoever brings this abomination about is going to change the rules and start to trample God's people and the holy city and control Jerusalem. And guess who's in Jerusalem during that time frame? It's the two witnesses. So why are they in mourning? I think they're in mourning because they observed the abomination of desolation happen. They watched them parade these idols inside of the temple that was devoted to the worship of the one true God. And they're constantly in a state of mourning over the fact that not only has the temple been desecrated by these idols, but Jerusalem, the city, is now under foreign domination. And it's more clear than it has ever been that Satan and the forces aligned with Satan, the forces of evil, are determined to destroy God's people and God's worship and wipe it from the land once and for all. So yeah, they've got a lot to mourn about. No wonder they're going around in sackcloth. Look at verse 4. It says, these are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. Now, again, this is another connection to an Old Testament prophet. If you look at the next subpoint here, it says 11:4 explicitly connects this prophecy to Zechariah 4:14. I recommend you go sometime to Zechariah 4, look it up, read it, study it. To be honest with you, I think it's more likely that John is just grabbing the imagery from that and bringing it over here, because when I read Zechariah 4, I don't see exactly how it connects to these 2 witnesses. It's describing in Zechariah 4 2 other people that were witnessing for God as a prophet in that time frame. One was a high priest named Joshua, and there was another figure there, I think maybe Ezra. But these 2 represented like God's representatives, the olive trees, right? The olive trees and lampstands. And basically what I think he's saying is, just like back in that time in Zechariah, there were 2 people appointed. Here in this time, there are 2 people that are appointed to stand before the Lord of the earth. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Look at verse 5. Verse 5 says this: if anybody would harm them. Now, think about this, right? Who would want to harm them? I'll tell you who would want to harm them. The Gentiles who are controlling Jerusalem. The person or persons who have set up the abomination of desolation. Can you imagine repurposing God's temple to worship some pagan idol shaped like a human? Or maybe to worship this person himself. Maybe he puts a statue of himself in there and says, come worship me. We'll talk about that later in chapters 13 and 14. And you have these 2 annoying prophets outside yelling and prophesying to people that all of this is a fake, that all of this is a lie. Don't worship that God. Worship the one true God who made heaven and earth. Like, how annoying would it be to try to set up your own personal worship and have these 2 annoying voices outside the door that are constantly criticizing, pulling a John the Baptist, always needling and bugging the people in power so that they have to deal with the fact that they're lying to people and they're leading everybody astray. Nobody would like that. So, of course, somebody at some point is going to say, seize them, right? Like every king ever does this. Seize them, silence them, get rid of them, kill them, put them in jail, do something with them. But look at this. Look at what happens to them in verse 5. If anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. if anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed. So the first group of soldiers come up to these guys and say, you don't have a permit to be out here. The guys in charge think you need to shut up. You're going to come with me. And they're like, oh, really? Take this. And like they're going to spit out fire and consume these soldiers that are coming to get them. And so they send another group, and the same thing happens, and another, and another. And like people start throwing rocks at them, and fire just goes out and consumes anybody who tries to attack them. So for the 3.5 years of their ministry, this is the next subpoint, they will be protected from harm. They get like a blank check. They know that nobody can hurt them. They know that they have sort of a charmed existence, right? So they could sit on the steps of the temple and say whatever they want to say on behalf of God as people are walking past them to go worship this false idol in the temple, the abomination of desolation. They could be like yelling out, they could be on CNN every single day prophesying the truth, sending out that message. And they're protected from anybody who would try to harm them. So you have to leave them alone. You have to let them speak. You want to talk about freedom of speech? They're given freedom of speech in the most uncomfortable kind of way. So you can believe that there are forces of evil that we have not met yet who are going to be looking for any opportunity that they can, the earliest opportunity that they can, to destroy these two voices. Okay? We'll come back to that in a minute. Now, notice also this. They have the ability, this is the next blank, they have the ability to perform miracles. Now, why did miracles happen in the Old Testament? There's two main reasons. One, God would do a miracle to rescue his people from danger. I think of the opening of the Red Sea at this point, right? That wasn't done to prove a point as much as it was to give God's people a way out of the problem that they were in. You know, they needed water, and God, Moses struck the rock and the water came out. Why was that? To prove a point? Not really. It was to give them water, right? Sometimes God would do miracles to rescue people from trouble. But here's the main other reason why God's prophets would sometime perform miracles. They would perform miracles to authenticate their message, right? Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. And Moses goes, God, I've got a problem. Pharaoh's not going to do it. He doesn't know who I am. He doesn't know who you are. And he's not going to let them go. So God says, okay, here's what I want you to do. You see that staff in your hand? You're like, yeah, I'm a shepherd. He says, throw it on the ground. It'll turn into a snake miraculously in front of their eyes. And then whenever you want to, you'll grab it by the tail, which, by the way, never grab a snake by its tail. Grab it by its tail, it'll become a staff again. He had another trick. Put your hand inside your shirt. Bring it out, and it's going to be full of leprosy and sores and oozing, gross pus dripping from this horrifying hand. Then put it back inside your shirt. Why you would want to do that, I don't know. But you put it back inside your shirt, pull your hand back out, it'll be as clean and as pure and as healthy as your hand has ever been in its life. Why do you do that? To prove that your words should be listened to. A miracle grabs the attention of the person who you've shown the miracle to say, the person who performed the miracle deserves your attention. Listen to them, right? That's one of the main reasons why Jesus performed miracles. Sometimes Jesus performed miracles just to help people who are in trouble. Just like God did in the Old Testament. They were in trouble, right? There's a storm and we're about to die. Jesus stands up and says, peace, be still, and it calms down. What's the effect of that? They make it to the other side without dying. But it also authenticates his message. It proves to everybody who sees the miracle, he's operating under God's auspices, and therefore you ought to listen to him. Do you remember what they said when he calmed the storm? They said, who is this man who controls the elements? The winds and the waves obey him. He must be the Son of God, right? Because being able to do a miracle authenticates you're on God's team. Therefore, I'm going to listen to what you have to say. These two witnesses are going to perform miracles. Not to do a cool pyrotechnic show to prove how cool they are, but because they want to establish without any doubt, you need to listen to what I have to say. This message that I'm saying that's unpopular, that the people outside of our umbrella of protection who want to kill us would love to shut us up, you absolutely 100% need to listen to this message because it's coming from God to you. Now, I don't know if you knew this or not, but miracles were actually quite rare in the Old Testament. I know it seems like we read every other page there's some kind of a miracle, but that's actually not true. Most of the miracles that happen through the ministry of 3 people, believe it or not. If you go through and catalog the miracles, you have Moses, who is able to do several miracles, right? The 2 I already mentioned, plus the other ones that he was a part of. He's the one that lifted up the rod, and then the waves parted for the Red Sea. I mean, Moses was a central figure in that. And then you have Elijah and Elisha, and they're able to do miracles. Elijah is able to stop. Remember, he stops the rain, and then he brings the rain back. Elijah can part the Jordan River. He hits it with his cloak, and the Jordan River parts. Then Elisha comes along, and Elisha is doing like a miracle a week. Like it seems like every time he turns around, he's doing miracle, 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 miracle. These 3 men, Moses, Elijah, and Elisha, seem to have access to miracles or the ability to do miracles. Now, most prophets, by the way, couldn't do this. Jeremiah, for example, was a highly regarded prophet later by the Jews in retrospect. During his time frame, nobody believed him. Nobody listened to him. He getting thrown in jail so much. At one point, he got thrown into a pit, and he was literally sinking in the mud while he's just waiting there. I mean, you want to talk about a horrifying place of imprisonment. There he is. He's probably not being fed or given much to drink. He's just there stuck. If he could have done a miracle, trust me, he would have to get himself out of that problem. Most prophets don't get to perform miracles. It's only a few. Now, this is what is interesting about these 2 witnesses. It seems like these 2 prophets have the ability to do miracles. And notice what kind of miracles they can do. Take a look at verse 6. Well, besides the fact they can do fire to burn up their enemies, that's kind of, that's a miracle. I'll give you that. But look at verse 6. They have the power to shut the sky that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. What does that sound like? Elijah, right? And they have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. Who does that sound like? Moses, right? Do you remember one of the plagues? Even the word plague makes you think Moses. But how about turning the Nile River into blood at one point, right? That is a Moses miracle. So he mentions 2 kinds of miracles, one by Elijah, one by Moses. And so that has led some interpreters to conclude that perhaps these 2 men are Elijah and Moses back from the dead, so to speak, or back from God's presence to earth, sent for a brief time to be these witnesses. Now, I will say this. I think that's unlikely. For one thing, wouldn't it make sense to just name them Moses and Elijah if it's really the Moses from the Old Testament and the Elijah from the Old Testament? To name them and say, here they are, they're back, so you really should listen? That would make sense to me. Now, you wouldn't have to do that. Maybe he's just counting on these miracles that they can do as a sign that people who are paying attention will realize it's Moses and Elijah. So certainly it's within God's scope and his capability to send Moses and Elijah back to earth for one final mission, right? Kind of the greatest hits. It's really interesting. Another reason people think this is because when Jesus goes on the Mount of Transfiguration to pray, do you remember who he hangs out with? Who appears with him and starts to talk with him? Yeah, it's our boys Moses and Elijah. Now, in that passage, they're actually named as Moses and Elijah. So we know that the biblical writers recognized them enough or had some indication of who they were and actually had the courage to name them. Here, John doesn't name them. Now, John, by the way, was one of the people on top of the mountain who saw Moses and Elijah talk to Jesus in Jesus' moment of transfiguration. So if he wanted to, he could have said Moses and Elijah. I saw Moses and Elijah again. I saw them back in John chapter 9, and here I am seeing them again. But he doesn't do that. So I'm inclined to think, this is my interpretation. Anyway. And again, if you want to say this is Moses and Elijah back for one last mission, I got no problem with that. I tend to think, though, because they're not named, that these are not the actual Moses, the actual Elijah, who are from ages past who have come back to life or whatever. I believe these are two of the 144,000 believers who were sealed and protected by God during Revelation chapter 7. You remember that, right? During the seal judgments, one of the things that God goes and he seals 144,000 Jews, and then he sends them out through the earth to be his witnesses, right? I think these guys are two of those 144,000. And they were just chosen to take this particular role. Now, we don't know where the other 143,998 guys are. I presume, or girls, I presume they're spread out all over the place doing whatever God wants them to do wherever they are. But these two guys are witnesses, and they are doing something. We know that and the reason why why he uses the language of Elijah and Moses to describe them is, again, the same reason that he talks about himself the same way as Ezekiel with the whole eating of the scroll in chapter 10. He's trying to say, no, these aren't actually Moses and actually Elijah, but they have the power of Moses and Elijah. They are speaking prophetically as Moses and Elijah did, and therefore you ought to listen to them as if they have the same authority as Moses and Elijah. They're to be taken that seriously. You're to take them that seriously. So, again, I think they were given these miraculous abilities to convince everybody who's paying attention that the God who is at work in the Bible is again at work. He has a message for humanity, and you'd better listen. So for 3.5 years, they're protected, and they're doing these miracles. They can make a drought happen anytime they want. They can turn water into blood whenever they want. They can cause all kinds of plagues to come whenever they want. Okay? So I imagine this would be a pretty interesting two guys to kind of keep an eye on for the 3.5 years that they're in ministry. But then something happens. Take a look at verse 7. Verse 7 says this, "And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit," and by the way, we haven't met that guy yet, all right? We're going to come back to him in chapter 13. But there's a figure, this beast, that rises from the bottomless pit. He will make war on them, he will conquer them, and he will kill them. Now, I want you to notice, I'm going to read the next several verses all together because a lot of stuff happens in a row, but I want you to notice something. What I'm about to describe to you is very similar to Jesus, okay? And that's what goes in the next blank. Their end is remarkably similar to Jesus's end. If you've read stories about the crucifixion, then this will sound incredibly familiar to you, okay? First of all, and I've already mentioned it, so I'm just going to give you the first arrow point here. They were killed by their enemies. Okay, Jesus was killed by his enemies. These two witnesses will eventually be killed by their enemies. But here's interesting. Only after they finished their testimony. That's when it's in the second blank there. They finished their testimony. Do you remember how Jesus kept saying, "The hour has come, the hour has come"? He would say things like, "I have finished the work you gave me here to do, and so now all that's left is to die on the cross and seal salvation for forever." Well, Jesus had a message from God to deliver. He delivered the message, and when the message was done, God's protection of him was removed, and they were able to take him and kill him and bring him to an end. But before that, by the way, people tried to kill Jesus way before they were able to kill Jesus. There was like at least 3 different times people tried to stone him and he escaped. Well, how did he escape? Because God protected him. It wasn't his time, the Bible says. It wasn't his hour. His hour came later where God removed the protection and did allow his enemies to kill him. So that's one similarity. Another similarity, this is the second arrow point, is that both Jesus and these two witnesses were martyred in Jerusalem. Take a look at verse 8. So, the beast from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them, verse 8, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. Now that's a direct reference to Jerusalem. Now it's really sad, by the way, that symbolically Jerusalem now is being called Sodom and Egypt. Like those are two names in the Old Testament that are not indicative of good things, right? Sodom is a city that is destroyed by God in Genesis 17 and 18 because of its terrible, wanton, evil wickedness, okay? And disregard for the poor and disregard for the weak. Their violence and their sexual immorality caused God to destroy them just with fire from heaven. I mean, this is a big deal. And then Egypt is the place where Israelites were captives for 400 years, right? So they were killed and their bodies are left laying out on the dirt, on the street. Remember if I said they're sitting on the steps to the temple? Maybe they're killed and they're left lying there. Their bodies left there for 3.5 days, I think it says here. It doesn't say that. It says that in verse 9. Their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city. And they make sure you understand what city he's talking about because it says where their Lord was crucified. Where was Jesus crucified? He was crucified in Jerusalem. But then take a look at this. This is where it gets crazy. Verse 9. For 3.5 days, some from the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents because these two prophets had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. So think about that. For 3.5 days, they're not allowed to be buried. I presume they died a violent death. And so they're laying there on the ground, blood seeping out, and them just their dead bodies there, perhaps starting to decompose, perhaps already having wild, birds and stuff on them to whatever. And there's going to be people that are watching their bodies, taunting them mercilessly. Ha ha ha! These two prophets who have tormented us for 3.5 years are gone. And then the rug gets pulled out. Take a look at verse 9. Verse 10. Or verse 11, sorry. But after the 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. That's pretty remarkable, right? They're lying on the ground for 3.5 days, proof positive they are dead, D-E-D, dead. They're not like partly dead and they just woke up out of a coma. No. These are people who are dead and everybody's watching them and they're laughing and they're sending each other presents, excited because these guys are finally dead. And now we're going to taunt their dead bodies in the street. And then a breath from God enters them and they stand up. Well, that's a resurrection. That's coming back to life. So here we go. Another similarity to Jesus is he was killed, and then it says 3.5 days. So that's a little different from Jesus. Jesus was on the third day. He was resurrected. But here we have 3.5 days later, they were resurrected. That's what goes in that third arrow there. They were resurrected after, and I say 3-ish days, okay? Because it's not exactly the same, but it's similar enough that you kind of, wow, this is a lot like what happened with Jesus. And then the next arrow says they were caught up to heaven in a cloud. Well, do you remember what happened to Jesus about 40 days or so after he rose from the dead and he was talking to his disciples? We talked about it in church last Sunday. If you were paying attention, I hope you were. Or no, 2 Sundays ago. Acts chapter 1. Jesus is there. He says, I want you to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth. And then he was lifted up from their midst and he was hidden by a cloud and disappeared from their sight. That sounds like an ascension to me. So these guys not only were resurrected like Jesus was resurrected, but they also ascended to heaven and were covered up by a cloud. That's another similarity. And then you have verse 13, and at that hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. So there was also a great earthquake on the day of their resurrection. Do you remember Jesus, when he was raised from the dead, there was an earthquake that day too? There was an earthquake, and that's one of the reasons that the stone rolled away. And there was this big shaking that happened, and that's why the Roman soldiers woke up, saw the angel, freaked out, ran away. So many similarities. As you're reading this, you go, man, it's almost like they're reenacting the story of Jesus in front of all these people. As if to say, You killed their Lord and Savior 2,000 years ago, and here you are, or not 2,000 years ago, who knows how many thousand years, right? And who knows how long before this will actually happen. You killed their Lord and Savior Jesus in this same spot, in the same way, for the same reasons. And here you are, however many thousand years later, and you still are doing the same thing. You're still sinning the same way. Oh, it's going to be bad for you. It's going to be bad for you. And you'll notice there's fear in the hearts of the people on the way out because they're like, oh boy, this is bad. This is bad. And they give glory to the God of heaven. Now, I don't think that means that they have mass repentance, but it's certainly for the moment at least, they're terrified and they give credit to God for doing all this. Now, there are some differences, right? The differences, and this is the next section here, it was different too. They were not buried. Jesus at least was buried, and he was out of public view for 3 days before he came back to life. These guys were not buried. They're left out there in the street to decompose and to be attacked by birds and wild animals and stuff like that and mocked. So they were not buried. The second one that's different is their enemies rejoiced over their deaths and their humiliation. Now, I can imagine that when Jesus died and he was in the grave, that Satan and all of his minions were having a wonderful time. But the truth be told, we don't know that Jesus' enemies were super happy to find out that Jesus died. We know that Pilate wanted him dead, or at least out of his hair. That the Jews wanted him out of their hair. They must have been rejoicing when they heard that this Jesus guy had died. Less so when they had heard that he had been raised from the dead. But their enemies rejoice. Now, we can picture that, but it is a little bit different. And then the third one, this is the major difference, I think. The enemies of the two witnesses actually, here's a blank, witnessed their resurrection and their ascension personally. The enemies. Do you notice that when Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus did not actually appear to any of his enemies before all this happened, right? He didn't. Who did he appear to? He appeared to Mary. He appeared to Peter. He appeared to the disciples in the upper room. He appeared to those two disciples on the way to Emmaus. He appeared to John. He appeared to all the people who already believed in him. He didn't go back to the temple and says, hey, high priests, here I am, I'm back. He didn't show up in Pilate's bedroom and go, Pilate, I told you should have let me go. He didn't do that. He didn't appear to his enemies. His enemies didn't witness his resurrection. They didn't witness his ascension to heaven. Only his disciples did. But here we have his enemies, their enemies, the two witnesses' enemies who killed them, witnessing them coming back to life. And with them, now, it says here, look, this is fascinating. Their enemies watched them, it says at the end of verse 12, as they went up to heaven. Jaws on the ground. And then the other thing that's different is that their enemies responded to what they saw with fear and with worship. They saw people coming back to life after 3.5 days of deadness, coming back to life and then ascending up to heaven to God. They knew that God had done it, and they knew that they were going to be held responsible for it, and they are filled with fear, and they even actually worship. That's very different from what happened to Jesus. All of Jesus' enemies tried to claim that he was still dead, that he didn't come back to life. So I have one last application point, and this is something that blows my mind. It blows my mind. Even now, even with how hard the hearts of humanity have become, and they've witnessed all these trumpet judgments, and they've witnessed people killed, they've witnessed natural disasters that have wiped out whole areas of the earth, God is still trying to give humanity a chance to repent. That's the last blank, repent. Even now, even with everything that they've seen, even with everything that they know, even with everything that they've done, God is still offering these people a chance to change. I mean, if he didn't care and he didn't want these people who witnessed all of this to turn around, why not just have them raise up during the night and go up to heaven at night? Why not just have them pull like an Obi-Wan when Darth Vader hits the thing and the body just disappears? Why couldn't God have done it that way? Why instead did he wait for daytime when everybody's watching, they come back to life, and then they slowly, I assume slowly, ascend up to heaven or are covered up by a cloud? Why would God do that if he wasn't trying to send one last message? Everybody, I control life and death. You think you win. You think you kill these people that were tormenting you. I can bring them back to life anytime I want. I can rescue them from you anytime I want. What makes you think I'm not going to be able to destroy and punish you for the sins you've committed unless you turn around? Why do you think you can get away with this? One last chance. Our God is patient. Our God is kind. Our God is gracious. Even in the midst of horrifying judgment, he's still offering one chance here, one chance there, giving people opportunities to turn around. Now, sadly, it doesn't seem that many people take advantage of these opportunities, but who knows? Maybe in a city of 1 million people, maybe there's 5 who see that and go, we've been wrong. We've messed this up. We got to turn around. And all of a sudden, all the things that those 2 witnesses had been saying, the message comes back to them. And they're like, oh my goodness, we're under judgment. Jesus came and we killed him. And now we've killed his other prophets. And now these judgments are coming. And one day Jesus is coming back and it's going to happen soon. And who knows, maybe there's a few people, a handful. We don't know about any. But perhaps, some people saw this and changed and had a heart transformation and were rescued from out of the middle of this horrifying devastation and destruction. The point I'm trying to make is whether there was anybody or whether there were hundreds of people who did, our God is kind and gracious. He's offering us a chance. And friends, our time, it's even more clear, right? Today is the day of salvation. Today is the day to fix that thing with God that's broken. Today is the day to humble yourself and say, I screwed up. I messed up. God, I need you. Please forgive me. Please fix this brokenness in me. Please bridge the gap between me and you. Please come back. Please let me come back to you. Today is the day for that. So maybe that's your application from today. We learned about 2 witnesses and what's going to happen someday in the future. But maybe we come to the end of this story, this rather disturbing story about these men, and we say, wow, even now God has given them a chance. Maybe God's given you a chance today as you're watching this. So just turn off the computer, just go to a quiet place if you can find one in your house, or go outside. I know it's cold, but go outside and find a place to sit. Just make things right with God. Just invite him in. Just throw up your hands and say, I surrender. I'm going to stop trying to run my life. God, you run it. You run it. You tell me how to live. You tell me how to love. You tell me how to be. That's what I'm going to do. I pray that you'll take advantage of this opportunity. And that maybe today will be your day of repentance. Now, verse 14 says, the second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come. So the second woe includes everything. It includes the ministry of the 2 witnesses, this entire time frame, and it includes trumpet 6, which is pretty closer to the end of the bowls. And it's like, okay, the third woe is about to happen. And in verse 15, we have the 7th angel blowing the 7th trumpet when the mystery of God is completed. And now we're going to all of a sudden see a very quick rushing to the end of the story. And it's funny because it's at this very moment that we're going to get a bit of a parenthesis in the rest of the story of Revelation. And for several chapters, we're going to find out some behind-the-scenes stuff that's been going on even way back before the events of the 7 years. It's like God waits till the middle of the story to tell us who some of the main characters are in the story, which is an interesting way to tell the story. Maybe not the way I would have done it, but God certainly knows better than me. So we're going to dive back into the second half of chapter 11 and into 12, 13, 14. And then when we get to 15, we're going to get to the bowls of God's wrath. And that's when it's really going to get crazy. So for the next few chapters, we're not necessarily moving forward in time in the 7-year period of the tribulation, but we're kind of filling in the gaps and learning things about who are the forces that are making this tribulation thing happen. So come back next week. We'll dive into that, and I hope it'll be helpful to you and maybe explain some mysteries, some things you've never understood before about the book of Revelation and how God's story comes to an end. Thanks for your time. Lord bless you. We'll talk to you next week.